Um, so I have to start on a somber note. You know that I'm in Macedonia because of a family emergency. Uh, just today, I lost my dad. He died, and I had a very difficult decision to make whether I hold this class or not. But my dad was a sports journalist, and he had a journalistic ethic, and he had never missed any sports game, any report that was due. And I know that he would have wanted me to do what was scheduled, regardless of the circumstances. And as a matter of fact, a lot of these kind of journalistic interests of mine are really inspired by my dad, who was a professional, who wrote a lot, who was kind of like a 20th century influencer, because everybody in Macedonia knew him and knew his voice. And he was the journalist that has the most minutes spoken on national radio in Macedonia because he's a sport journalist. So, the games were 90 minutes long. And yeah, I see Alexander nodding. I see Ilya here. So, it's for another generation where the radio was really influential. And it's kind of, bittersweet to see his era come to an end literally, but then some of the work ethic and some of the tradition continuing. So, thank you for indulging me with this moment. I felt that I needed to pay tribute to him. And yeah, thank you for being with me here to share this moment because again, it is bittersweet, but it was a life worth living. So yeah, now that that's out of the way, I really had to say it. I think we can get down to what we're really here for, and that is a fascinating discussion with Evelyn McLean. Evelyn, I'll do the introduction the way I got to know you, and then you will fill in blanks because I honestly don't know much about your career. All I know is that a couple of months ago, like half a year ago, somebody posted a beautiful history of MRI and how MRI research came to be and how the Nobel Prize came to be. And then what really caught my eye is that it was talking about the Beatles and the EMI label. And by the way, the Beatles were my dad's favorite band. So, there's another connection. And the way that it was written, I was like, I have to meet this person. Now, it wasn't really clear who wrote that. So I had to do some sleuthing. Eventually, I figured it out. She posted this on Milan Cvetkovic's blog. And this seemed like a one-off thing. Evelyn just decided to write about MRI. Maybe she'll tell us a little bit more how that came about. And then an RA of mine, Nadia Blostein, she got in touch with Evelyn, and we said, we want to invite you in the course. And maybe you can write something that is on a related topic because you're a great science writer. And she said, well, I'm not really a science writer, but I'm interested in science and technology. But I would love to write something. And what I sent you and also shared in the Google Calendar is an original essay that Evelyn wrote about the history of amateur science. I think it's very appropriate that it's written kind of like by an amateur science journalist. I hope that that's something that you would explore further because I really enjoy your writing. And I really hope that this discussion will provoke a lot of follow-ups and a chance for us to keep working together. I have a message from Alyssa that the Slido isn't active, which is strange because I think it's here. No,
It
you're
is
right.
active. It is active.
No,
It's
you're
just
right.
it has to.
You're right.
Oh,
So you know
perfect.
what? Let me just create another Slido. Either I can put a different end date. Let's see if I change. No, the maximum length is 1 week. So if you put the 21st, can you try it now? Because now maybe it's not finished. Okay, so can somebody just type something on Slido? As you know, we go with some recommendations. Yeah, so feel free to recommend maybe in honor of my dad, some kind of a radio personality, a podcast that you're following, something that you really enjoy. Um, I will recommend a podcast. It's called Hit Parade. And it's an amazing music podcast that shares the history of famous and sometimes forgotten artists. So that would be my recommendation for the week. Hit Parade. podcast, and I will share the link. Chris Malamphy is the guy who narrates it, and he's really, really, really good. So let me just type here in the chat. That's my favorite podcast. And let's see whether we can get this up on Slido. Can somebody type something just so I see whether it works? Can somebody confirm that the link worked? Oh yeah, could I send the link? So it's Slido, and then it's number 3630331. Okay, Alyssa, it works. Perfect. All right. So now that a lot of this preamble is out of the way, I would like to welcome Evelyn. And maybe, Evelyn, we can start by me getting to know you a little bit better. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background and how you came about to be writing about science.
Yeah. It's funny. I was like thinking about a lot of the characters that people I wrote about from the history of science have some similarity to my background in the sense that they're not really restricted to any one particular kind of project or field. Yeah, and that's definitely how it sounds when I describe what I do and what I've done. I have a degree from the Evergreen State College, which is an interdisciplinary public school in Olympia, Washington.
Are you originally from Washington?
I'm not. I'm from California. So
okay.
I was mostly a performing artist when I was growing up. I studied music and performing arts. So singing and acting was like a big thing in my early life, and I did that pretty seriously. And then I got into writing in towards the end of high school and ended up
What
after
part of
some
California? I'm curious.
in LA.
In LA. Okay, because I
Mhm.
was in Northern California during my high school years, but that's
Oh,
Ukiah, like a tiny town in
oh
Northern
yeah.
California.
Yeah. I live close to not far from Ukiah now. I drive through it.
Cool.
And I'm driving to California because I live in Portland now.
Mhm.
So I grew up doing performing work, although I always wrote, but I was mostly writing poetry. And then when I finally went back to school after like not sure what I wanted to do, um, I went to Evergreen and did quite a lot of poetry there, and also studied some environmental science and some philosophy. Got really interested in science. Took like one semester of a class that covered like it's a different structure there. So instead of taking 4 or 5 classes in different topics, you take 3 or 4 classes that are integrated and taught by 2 or 3 teachers, all on one subject. So I took like one semester of like what might be considered like a hard science. Like I took like a semester that had like chemistry and statistics, and I was like, cool, this is cool. Don't know if I want to get a good degree in this. Like not sure I'm gonna see myself working in a lab. So I really enjoyed learning about the topics though. So I mostly ended up doing writing. You don't graduate there with a degree in any particular subject, really. You just get a degree in liberal arts. And then I've been doing a lot of various projects since then. I've been writing with a group of other writers for meeting and writing together for 8 years,
Mhm.
producing essays and some experimental writing, and also hosting artists like in like we do like an annual retreat that we host for other artists, and working on a second collection of essays right now altogether. Um, and then another project I have going on, I made a comedy web series last summer. So I like wrote a comedy show and produced it and acted it with my friends. So like, and now we're trying to get that off the ground. So there's like a lot of different projects I'm working on. In the meantime, I decided to go back to school. I'm studying to be a social worker, and I had an interest in social science. So in the process of deciding to go back to school, I did a couple of years of just like online classes, and took a neuroanatomy class, and got really interested in neuroscience. And I was already following a lot of like the last 8 years, I've been really like following a lot of rationality flavored writing. I'm like a religious reader of Slate Star Codex, or what used to be called Slate Star Codex. This is a blog
I'm
by
curious,
Scott
how many of you here have heard about Slate Star Codex? I'm just going to do this poll. It's basically a yes or no poll. And I'm curious. So Scott Alexander, Slate Star Codex, Astral Codex 10, several different names. We actually have a couple of people. I have a guess that these are the Macedonians
Alexander.
because we've had our meetups where we kind of, discuss Scott Alexander.
Oh
So
yeah.
looks like we have, we even have a Astral Codex 10
Oh
meetup
wow.
in Skopje.
Oh cool. Um,
So this is a 3 out of 19. My guess is these are the Macedonians.
yeah. Well, I highly recommend it. That was the blog that basically gave me a lot of skill in terms of reading and understanding scientific literature. Scott Alexander, he's a physician. Actually, he's a psychiatrist, but he writes a lot about science and technology and about culture as well. He's really broad a range of writing, but he very frequently does like a case study or like an analysis of a bunch of different papers. He did a really good one on ivermectin that I recommend. Um, and you just
He usually
over
calls
time,
these more than you wanted to know, like
yes,
ivermectin,
more than
more
you
than you
ever
wanted to
wanted to
know.
know, right? About the effect of vitamin D on illness or
Yeah.
whatever it is. Yeah. So then you just like get and it's very readable. It's not that's the whole thing, is that it's like he sort of takes away some of the formality of scientific writing. And he's a quite good judge of whether the papers that he's reviewing, like where their flaws are and their weaknesses and what he finds unique about the way that they were done and so forth. So over time developed some scientific literacy just sort of informally by reading, and got this opportunity to write about the history of MRI sort of accidentally. My partner works in um, venture capital in mental health. So he's sort of indirectly like interfacing with a lot of people who know about who are working on neurotechnology. And one of his friends who's working in neurotechnology wanted people who maybe didn't even have research experience to write about neurotechnology and sort of like inform, sort of like bring more information to the world about like what is neurotechnology, what is its history, what's already been done, what fields do we have a lot of information about, like so he suggested MRI, so I wrote a paper about the history of MRI and learned
Why
much more than I
MRI
ever
of
wanted
all
to know.
things?
Well, he just gave me a list. Honestly, he gave me
Okay.
a list of things that he was like, these are questions I have, like, and I picked the one that I was most familiar with. I was like, oh yeah, MRI, I know about that. Kind of. I knew nothing about it really. But that was there was a lot of stuff on there I'd never heard of. So I was like, oh, I'll just start with something I know.
So this is fascinating because the reason I ended up in MRI is I took a freshman course in physics. And it
Huh?
was this kind of, advanced freshman course at Stanford. And part of it was you write an essay on a topic you're interested in.
Mm.
And then basically they gave us 20 different topics. And then somehow I ended up choosing MRI
Huh.
and writing an essay about it. And
That's
then 30
so, what
years
a weird
later, not
coincidence.
25 years later, I am doing MRI. So
That's
somehow something sticky about it, I guess. It really kind of draws you in.
well, it really has an interesting history. That's another thing about it. And it has a really interesting history, and hadn't actually found that there hadn't been that much writing about it. There isn't like a
Right,
single
right.
book about the history of MRI. I found like a few books that cover the history of medical imaging, and sort of cover X-ray, MRI, CT, and beyond. But that really is like a pretty unexplored subject in at least public facing science writing,
Yeah.
or like science writing for the
But it
layperson.
has its
So
huge scandal, right? Like it has
oh
something
yes,
that
it has
is really
multiple
kind of,
scandals. Yes, it's like all it's a really interesting. And as I was doing it, this is actually like my first time like doing a piece about the history of some scientific invention. And all these conventions that you hear of when you're reading about science is like comes like you it starts to be very real. For example, that multiple people make discoveries at the same time, that that it's really hard to assign credit or priority, like these kinds of or that you find out about someone who actually discovered some version of the same principle like 40 years before anyone else, but they never got funding. Like this kind of thing happens just in every area, every scientific and technological development. That feels even more true to me, having written this piece about amateur science, where you just hear about people who like sort of stumbled across something and then it didn't take, or people who like discovered a principle but just missed one important piece, something like this, or just were mistranslated or misinterpreted for like centuries before someone found like the corrected the problem. Yeah, it's a really like, this is the way that you start to understand that science is an extremely human endeavor, because people are constantly misunderstanding each other. People miss their moment. They like could have met the right person, but they didn't, that kind of thing. So it is a really good source of stories. There's lots of like good stories in it.
I have to say, the way that you wrote that piece really reminded me of the way that Bill Bryson writes about science. Now, I don't know if you know who Bill Bryson is. He's my favorite travel writer. Like he writes about continents and countries. And then he decided to write this book. It's called A Brief History of Almost Everything. And it's basically a history of science book. It's my favorite, probably one of the best history of science books ever written, because it's written with a flair, because it has personality. So, like it's that kind of, let me tell you how the Beatles influenced the invention of MRI. And I think, I really connect to that kind of writing. That's the kind of writing that I encourage the students in this class to try. Kind of, give me a unique angle. Like, why would I ever remember an essay on the history of MRI if it wasn't for this weird connection that made me look out for Evelyn, find her, ask her to work with me, and, have a collaboration? Because, Evelyn, the way that I teach them in this class is that it's not all about criteria and filling out 90% of the assignments. It's really about sticking out, really about making an impression in a very limited amount of time. So their case studies that they're going to be presenting throughout the course are really kind of 3-minute distillations of something that they're passionate about. And then here I am kind of as a judge, clueless about what they're writing about, but somehow they need to convince me that they're right and that they're passionate, and I should not poke holes in their presentations. So I feel that this kind of, illustration of how this collaboration between the two of us came about, hopefully is inspiring, because it's really completely left field. Stuart and Matt, they're in the field. I kind of knew that I would invite them. But Evelyn is completely a wild card. And I enjoy the opportunity to work with people that, just do things out of the box. And again, that's by everything that you told us until now, you fit that bill box, whatever.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it's funny. You're making it sound like the Beatles connection was like a big chunk of the essay. It's really just like several sentences at the very beginning. Exactly. It's like, you really don't have to the history of MRI. Quite a lot of that paper is actually very dry. Or the content's quite dry. It's like this person made this discovery, and then this person made this discovery, and then this person got this kind of funding. But every once in a while you stumble across like a little interesting anecdote, and if it's interesting to you, if it catches your eye, you just gotta put it in, because like this is like how you take science. This is how you take like we think of as science writing now, which is very by the book. It's very formal. It's very like including the relevant things, excluding the irrelevant things. And that's like, it's just not compelling. It's people find it hard to get through, because people connect with stories. People connect with stories about like coincidences and other people and strong feelings and characters that are like unpredictable. And like, so like if it's interesting to you, even if it's kind of tangential, if you put it in the writing, people will remember it.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful setup. So I'm really glad that you kind of gave us the motivation, because now we're going to get to a topic that, again, you and I put together with Nadia. Nadia just joined. I don't know if she can talk, but Nadia, good to see you here. Nadia was instrumental in putting this class together. I think she's doing something. So let's give her a moment. There she is. All right. Hi, Nadia.
Hi, sorry, I had to leave in the middle of the class. So it was like,
No
nice to
worries.
see
So
you.
Nadia did an RA with me for a year, and basically when she came, she said, I'm applying to med school, but I'd like to get exposed to research. It was a great year. It was very productive. Now she's off to med school. So let's wish her luck. But I'm glad that she's here because Nadia, Evelyn, and I spent quite a lot of hours working together on the topic of first deciding on a topic and then actually coming up with this essay that Evelyn wrote. So yeah, good to see you. So I think this is a good setup for me to stop talking a little bit, give Evelyn some time to tell us, the story behind the piece, maybe a little bit of context for why amateur science is important, was important, will be important. And as we said, no PowerPoints. So I rely on Evelyn's storytelling skills. And then we're all here to kind of improvise and riff on it. So Evelyn, tell us how that story came about, what piqued your interest, how you put together the piece, and what you think the main take-home points of that piece are.
Yeah. I'll start with the last question first. I think the thing that strikes me the most and was really compelling as I was reading more about the history of science is like science just wasn't a job. It just wasn't always a job. There was like most of human history, people were just doing something that we now sort of think of as related to science, scientific activity, but it wasn't a thing you could decide to do like as your career. It wasn't like a thing no anyone was ever going to pay you to do. And like there was no such thing as like a scientist in the sense that there was no people just weren't like I'm going to focus and specialize on this one subject and I'm going to develop this theory. It was much more like motivated by people's curiosity, and it was much more heterogeneous, just a mix of things that people felt compelled by. Yeah. So I think the biggest takeaway for me was like it's just like at least I really thought of science as like a job, a career, or a sort of like a thing you point your whole life towards or your whole mind towards. And almost all of human history, it's been a lot less well defined than that, and really much more integrated into the way people live, more integrated into their sense of spirituality, more integrated into the like their community, who they're connecting with, and just like way less defined as a very specific slice of things you can do or a set of activities. How I came to write about this partly is that I'm like, as I mentioned, I've been reading blogs in this like kind of rationalist blog sphere for a while. And I have some friends also who it's become more and more common in my peer group for people to do scientific research or just like deep research into subjects that they don't have any interest or any degree in or any specialty in. And it's actually just become much more common for people I know to be doing work that they don't have a degree to do. This is, I think there's like a big movement sort of generally away from people feeling the need to be credentialed in order to be able to research something they're curious about or work on problems they're curious about. Obviously, this is much easier to do if you're doing computer science because you can do computer science if you have a computer, number one. And number two, there's a way to test for, there's a way to test for capacity or ability in computer science that's very straightforward. You give people a coding challenge and then they can do it and then you can hire them. You don't necessarily have the same kind of metric. So other kinds of fields are like slowly catching up to this new paradigm where you don't necessarily have to have a degree in order to be knowledgeable or skilled in a field. And so it's become slightly more common. And I have at least one friend, but I have several acquaintances who have been doing essentially independent research on a variety of topics for the last couple of years. One friend, her name is Ayla. She's currently doing quite a lot of research on sexuality. And in particular in kink and gender research and the interplay between gender and sex. I have another couple of friends who are working in this field as well. Someone I know who just published a book about this, in particular about like transsexual identity, and another person that they're both connected to who has a blog, who writes a lot about this, and conducts studies. So back to Ayla, her biggest research so far, her biggest project has been is a big survey she did on the internet and still going about the subject of about a wide variety of kinks, basically. And
When
I
you
think
say
she's
big, we're talking hundreds of thousands.
I think we're above 160,000.
Actually, last I heard was 600,000, but I might be
Oh yeah,
wrong.
that's right. That's right. Yes.
It's a huge number of
600,000
responses.
people
Yeah.
have taken the survey so far.
And just for comparison, us scientists usually work with 10. 100 is a big study. Psychologists, a couple of hundred. So this is really just science at scale unimaginable for many working scientists.
And it's certainly the biggest study of this type that's ever been done. And it's ongoing. She's continuing to collect results and continuing to kind of analyze and do studies on her data as she goes. Her data is also all entirely available on her blog. So she makes that public, and she's like curious to help other people with research projects that can use her data. So that is one of the reasons I got interested.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe this is a good time to stop, and I think that brings us back to kind of the beginning of your piece. So there's a question for Kirill. Kirill, feel free to turn on your mic. If not, I will just read your question. So he says, until when was this the case that basically scientists were not professionals? Because if we consider ancient natural philosophers as scientists, weren't they actually working full-time on such problems, such as Archimedes, Eratosthenes? Now, I know that you have Aristotle's story there, and maybe that might be a good one, but maybe, let's answer Kirill first, and then we continue.
Right, yeah. It's a good point. I think I'm defining professional in maybe like a more narrow way. I would say that the version of a professional scientist that we recognize today, where like you're working within an institution, you've been credentialed, you're being paid by a government or by a private corporation, your time is spent in a way that has to be legible to other people. All of that is relatively new. That's, I would say, like end of the 19th century, basically, and sort of expanding slowly. I'm excluding from that definition people who were working in early universities, even though they were teaching and like writing and talking about science, partly because they were not being paid to do that. Actually, they were being paid to lecture about what the set of ideas that was very much a part of the curriculum. So they were not being paid to research. The model of doing research as part of like professors doing research as part of their role in academia didn't come around until the 1800s. So when people were working, like early natural philosophers did run their own schools, did spend their own time like researching, writing, and debating with other philosophers, creating their own theories and teaching their curriculum. But many of them had to basically find a way to fund that. And if they if they were rich, or basically if they had a patron, is essentially how they did it. I'm using this particular definition of professional because there is a general process over time in which the activities of science became professionalized, in the sense that they became something people did between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. 5 days a week, and that they were paid by an organization to do. What people, and this is just sort of generally a trend that happened starting in the science or starting the Industrial Revolution, when like people got jobs rather than had vocations, or they were like, you know, like, or had a role in society, basically. So there's a kind of like very particular lens I'm using to think about the way modern professional scientists do science as a job, rather than the way people might, who had the funding, might have wanted to spend their free time in the
And
past.
as a concrete answer to Kirill, I'm not sure about Archimedes, I'm not sure about Eratosthenes, but Evelyn included the case study of Aristotle. And actually, I didn't know that it took a while until Aristotle became Alexander's tutor. So basically, he wasn't really somebody who was doing science professionally. He had different kinds of appointments. And Evelyn, remind me, the story. I know that you explained basically what he did before he came to Macedonia. It's nice that
Well, he was
Macedonia
born in
actually makes an
Macedonia, actually.
appearance. Yeah, Macedonia makes an appearance in your post, which is great.
That's
I didn't
correct.
ask
Yes,
you to do that.
he was born in Macedonia.
Yep.
When in his late teen years, he ended up in Athens. He studied with Plato, and then spent several years traveling, including like part of what you would imagine as like his scientific work. A big chunk of it happened when he went to the Isle of Lesbos with a student. They spent that time basically researching and doing the foundational work for what would then become zoology, biology, botany, and a bunch of other like sort of naturalistic science fields. So they mostly studied the plant life and the animals in two lagoons on the Isle of Lesbos. Then he was invited back to become a tutor to the king's son in Macedonia. And even as a tutor, like, is very limited selection um, of topics he can teach. So like there was even though he was like a scientist and a philosopher in his own right, there's an approved set of topics he was allowed to like pass on. Yep. Some of them were probably things he had learned from Plato and ideas of his own, but a lot of that was just like what was considered to be the true knowledge of the time.
And his books, if I remember correctly, came later in his life. Like, like the famous Aristotle books were written after Alexander the Great, like, when he was pretty old.
Yes. So he then, after he was finished as a tutor, he went back to Athens and started his own school and lectured on his own ideas, and then mostly wrote his greater work, like the large body of his work, when he had moved back to Athens.
So then, we start with this kind of Greek philosopher's life, and then we kind of get to the Middle Ages, I guess, where it paid off to be independently rich or to have a rich patron. I guess the other possibility was be part of the clergy and try to do science within the church.
Yes.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that period.
Another possibility is that, and what mostly was the case, was that you just had a job.
Right.
So you could end up, most people who ended up going to university, and the university system in Europe started in the 11th and 12th century. And that came directly out of the clergy. Basically, like a group of disciples would follow around a learned friar who would be traveling from town to town. And once the group of disciples got so large that it was unwieldy to move from town to town, they would sort of set up shop in a township and kind of informally start their school there, so that people could come to them. And then they sort of over time got to have special rules, or sort of have their own institution that was like run sort of set with a different set of rules than the rest of the town, or laws. So this is how sort of the origin of academic freedom, and the ability to consider potentially heretical ideals, came from this sort of special set of special jurisdictional rules that were applied to universities, and they started just as groups of the clergy, basically.
And you have the story of Roger Bacon, right?
Yeah,
so
I do. Yeah. So
yeah, he was one of your case studies.
So at the same time that the clergy, he's a 13th century scholar, and at the same time that the clergy was able to support people doing this research and thinking and writing, most of which for many centuries was largely based on the writing of Aristotle. And a lot of the work that happened for centuries after the end of antiquity was just people responding to Aristotle and trying to interpret Aristotle and the commentaries on Aristotle, and trying to sort of make them work with religious theory. So there's like a lot of this intention to integrate religious theory and scientific theory, and they definitely weren't like separate in the way that we think of them now. So this is very much also a history of religion, a history of science. And once, oh my God, I forgot what was the question. Oh, Roger Bacon.
Roger Bacon, yeah.
So he was a clergy member. He was also a teacher. Well, first he was a teacher. He was lecturing on a lot of topics that Aristotle had written about, like geometry, arithmetic, and music, and astrology, which was like big at the time, and big through all of history. Like astrology was like definitely a huge scientific topic. He became a Franciscan friar, and had started, well, he was actually just traveling around. There's like a period of time people don't know very much about, where he was traveling around as an independent scholar, and we don't really know how he was making money at that point or who he was living with. But then when he became a Franciscan monk, he moved into a monastery, and was continuing to write. He, at the time before he moved in, he had basically read like everything about optics that had essentially ever been written, which this is like the field that has to do with vision and light. And he started writing about optics, and then there was like a papal decree that any published work written by a friar had to be approved before it could be published. So this kind of put him in a bad position, and he was wanting to do this work without having to go through the Catholic Church, the bureaucracy of the Catholic Church, essentially. So the monks in his monastery assigned him the kind of work that couldn't be done while he was thinking or writing. They just basically kept him busy so that he wouldn't continue to publish. He was then just like looking for a patron who would be able to support him in his research. Eventually he found one, a person he was communicating with, another friar, and that guy, and I didn't write this into the paper because I wasn't sure how relevant it was, but he ended up becoming the Pope. So he had the support of the Pope, or a guy who became the Pope of another scholar, and the Pope essentially told him, I will support your writing, but just keep it a secret. Just don't let anybody know that you're doing it. So sometimes the work was directly supported by the church, and it was all above board. Sometimes doing the work was explicitly against the wishes of the church, and you were having to find like supporters or time or secret spaces to work so that you could publish your work and other people would read it.
Cool. So that kind of brings us to the invention of the printing press. I guess that's kind of the next big evolution of science and the way that it was practiced. Yeah, printing press to scientific journals. Who's doing all this printing?
The printing press just sort of like, there's a couple of 100 years in between the printing press and scientific journals, but what was started by the printing press was just like an increase in literacy. People just, more and more people could read. Reading was an interesting thing. People started publishing books and writing books. Whereas previous to the printing press, basically all scientific communication was happening in books that were handwritten and owned by rich people or the church, and in letters. So like lots and lots, like almost all scientific communication was happening with scientists who knew of each other and were writing to each other, or had met in some kind of educational or church institution and then were writing to each other. The invention of the scientific journal came around in the 16th century, when several years after the first scientific, what is it called? School? What's the word?
Society.
Thank
Royal,
you. Yes.
we're talking about the Royal Society, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Scientific societies, two scientific societies were born within a couple of years of each other, one in London and one in France. And many were emerged after that, but those were the two historically like biggest and most important scientific societies. And several years after each of them was founded, they started publishing a journal, which originally was just the letters that people were writing each other, but sort of like making them more widespread. And part of the reason for that was it was a hugely onerous activity to be communicating exclusively by letter to such a large network of scientists. This is like a lot of the work of being a scientist was actually just keeping in touch with a lot of people, and people spent quite a lot of time doing that. And at this point, the pace of scientific discovery had started to increase to such a degree that it was quite difficult to stay on top of how many discoveries were just happening. So many more people were doing science. And this was also the early part of the scientific method, which is another Bacon, Francis Bacon, popularizing the scientific method, happened around this time. So many more people were using the scientific method and doing experimental work rather than just observational work. So there was like a lot more discovery happening. So there was a lot of information to keep track of. And that was part of the reason that these societies formed, so that people could do experiments with each other and could use each other as witnesses for the experiments they were doing, so that they could publish and say, it wasn't just me who saw this. The results of my experiment were witnessed by all these other well-to-do, very like important or trustworthy gentlemen. And then as that activity increased, they started publishing the letters and then eventually the reports that documented these experiments.
So now we're kind of entering the golden age of science, one would say. The scientific method is established. There is so many new discoveries to make. Basically, this is the time when Newton comes about, Galileo, Copernicus, lots of heretical thought happening, and always kind of, by the church turning a blind eye, or, not really kind of policing hard, but every now and then they would. So you have these scientists who are pretending not to be scientists, who, will say there's something else, but in reality, all they're obsessed about is science. And that pursuit gives way to a lot of inventions. Like this is, when we're discovering the world. This is when we're kind of navigating the seas, when gunpowder gets invented, who knows? And then eventually that leads to some professionalization. So can you tell us how that professionalization came about?
Yeah, so part of this, what comes out of this extremely rich couple of centuries of discovery is a couple of like pretty profound shifts in the understanding of society itself. Like the change that happens, part of the reason the church is so resistant is because the dogma of the church, the orientation of the church and its role in society just does dramatically change because of the new discoveries happening in the scientific world. And one of those changes is that people start to really wonder about what is the optimal organization of society, who should have power, how should science and other subjects be organized, like who should get to take part in research and learning, and who should have power overall. So like part of what happens as a result of the scientific revolution is the Enlightenment, which is a period of time where we just totally revolutionize our ideas about how it's okay to structure society. or what, like how people should be organized. This is like the French Revolution has like a big effect on the way the French government was supporting the Royal Academy and paying, so basically like giving money to the Royal Academy because the idea was any discoveries that are made using the scientific revolution probably can be used by the government. That's like a useful tool for the government to improve. And over time, the idea actually changes to any discoveries that can be made through the scientific method and in the revolution of science could actually be used to improve society. And this becomes a much more egalitarian ideal. At the same time, the world is being settled by colonial powers, and there's a real question about equality. And immediately following that period is the Industrial Revolution, where there's rapidly increasing sort of like change in society, and you have the creation of the middle class. You have like radical changes in people's quality of life as they move into cities and as city is industrialized, and all of this like brings up several centuries of like really like profound change in ideas and new ideas about how society should be structured. So the government begins to take a different role. Yeah.
Evelyn and I made a deal that, I might interrupt. It's weird on Zoom, right? So sorry, I have to kind of jump in.
Yeah.
But, Faranak asked an insightful question, and I don't have an answer. I'm curious how you're going to answer. Faranak, should I read it, or do you want to say it? I'll read it. Can it be said that the involvement of governments in the advancement of science has the same role as the involvement of clergy in science? Like drawing a parallel on, the institutions versus the science.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question because of where we're at today. And because of the way the project of science has changed dramatically. So one parallel, I would say it's a very true comparison, or it's a very rich comparison. And one similarity is that much of the government or the church-sponsored science had the intention of creating science that supported the church's project, supported church doctrine and strengthened and helped us understand God's world, the mechanics of God's world that he created. And a lot of the science that has been funded by the government, especially in this transition towards the professionalization of science in the last 150 years or so, has been very much in the image of what government, this version of government, the modern government, thinks its role is in society. So, for example, like the Manhattan Project and the space race are two like prototypical examples of a kind of scientific project that can only exist because of the government's role in science, because they're so complex, they're so resource intensive, and they require so much coordination. So the government is serving both as a resource in terms of financial support, but also as a hub through which many, many different actors involved in an incredibly complex process can coordinate. And they're specifically, these projects were like conceived of as governmental projects. They have a political end. And this is, I think, the biggest question that came up in the study of amateur science is like, what happens when your whole realm of science is dictated, the direction and the purpose are dictated by this one central body, or around the world by the sort of like the paradigm that all of our governments are creating together. Yeah, it's a really good question.
Thank you. Yeah, that was excellent. I guess that kind of brings us to big science, right? So, we had this period of industrialization, we had this period of science as a common good, advancing society, and then eventually things get really bureaucratic, can we say, in the sense that we have the profession of scientists now.
Yes, and the profession of science is unfortunately extremely effective for some ends. It's very easy to manage. Governments are able to set goals, and science can work towards them. But there are several. There are, like, you can think of science as being able to, like, operate within two paradigms. You can think of normal science, as Kuhn called it, which is happening incrementally. It's happening within one paradigm or one model. For example, physics for a long time was within one model. And then new discoveries. So, like, every discovery that happens within that model, that's incremental. You're just kind of building out that model piece by piece. Then there's another paradigm, some new discovery that completely shatters the previous paradigm, some anomaly that that requires you to question all of the previous assumptions of that model, and create a new model in order to explain this anomaly, in order to be able to place this new fact into a sensical system. Currently, this model of professional science and the way it's centrally run by the academic institution and government really makes this new paradigm shifting kind of scientific discovery process very difficult. There's a number of incentives in the way that government and academic funded and organized science that work against paradigm shifting discoveries either happening at all. It works against people being able to do the research that helps them find these kind of, like, totally, like, model breaking discoveries and anomalies, or prevents them from being published or disseminated in a way that's effectively changing the model. This is just a problem of some degree to the way humans work. There's, like, this idea that, like, science advances one funeral at a time. This is partly just a psychological problem. People are very attached to their work and to the models they create, and it can be very difficult to wrest the power from one scientific hero in a field to a new model while that person is still alive. People get, like, kind of really invested in the character or in the charisma of a certain scientist, and then it can be hard to shift the idea during that person's lifetime. But actually, the incentives in the current system make it much harder as well. For example, there's an increasing number of scientific papers being written every year, and there's research that shows that a glut of scientific research papers in a particular field can make it hard for new discoveries to be disseminated. The more research there is in any field, the more it's a kind of winner-take-all effect where citations go to the most cited papers. And any new discoveries that even can be made in a field where there's a lot of papers coming out just don't get any publicity. So we're overlooking and not able to support the new discoveries that we are actually making when there's just this vast amount of reading and studying that has to be done to keep up with it.
And I think this kind of, science by consensus, or very recently even science by petition, where you have an appeal to authority, 100 scientists agreed on something, is really kind of going against the spirit of this kind of amateur scientist who really wants to discover the world and doesn't care what the consensus is. So I think this kind of bureaucratization, and again, Alexander and Kirill are having some comments in the chat, so feel free to read them. But I think that bureaucratization of science also comes with kind of this appeal to authority, which again, we've never been free of. The church was that authority before, but it's just not conducive to the spirit of inquiry. And I sent you a link yesterday. I don't know if you want to kind of tie it to that, something that happened very recently that's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, so I don't know very much about the particular subject, so I won't speak
Neither
to
do
it.
I. No idea. But
so
I'm curious, actually, how many of you are aware of this whole integrated information theory is pseudoscience letter that came out? I just want to do a poll. Yeah, so again, as expected, not many, but about a quarter of you, 5 people have said yes, you're aware of it. Maybe somebody's actually knowledgeable about it. I'm thinking of the profiles that we have here. Anybody care to tell us what the issue is? Out of 5, one person, maybe. I have no clue what IIT is, so my explanation is probably going to be worse. Alexander.
Take this with a huge grain of salt, but I think it was about IT refers to information theory. So it goes that whether information theory is science, for me it is, but in the hardcore origins. So for example, if you take it from the seminal papers of Shannon, if you take that to the information theory, it's certainly science because our communication networks based on it. I mean, are based on it. So, but then you have offshoots, and that's what I commented about just now in the chat, addressed to you, because we live in an age where the same communication networks based on information theory are now networking the human minds across the planet. And now you cannot tell, it's an age of influencers, who is right and who is wrong. So you have these offshoots saying basically that, for example, the human mind, consciousness works on the basis of information theory. In astrophysics, which is closer to my expertise, there is a famous professor here in Amsterdam who is proposing that gravity is emerging from information theory concepts. Now, people are split on it because there is no way to test it yet. But you can imagine, okay, this is hardcore astrophysics. But if you go whether consciousness is based in information theory, again. So I suppose that this hoopla on the social platforms is based on this, although I have just seen a few tweets and I haven't had the time to go in depth and read the comments and counter comments. But I guess it hangs around in there somewhere because it's catchy. I mean, information theory posits that information is connected to entropy, and we connected it to black hole properties, which we cannot test. And it's very good because you can write a whole bunch of sci-fi novels on it, and movies can be made, and it's very nice to think about. And then you go into a tangent.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Alexander. That lays it out in much better context than I could. So I appreciate the connection to Shannon. And then Andre raised a hand. So Andre.
I think basically this is like IIT is not that new. Like it's relatively old, and the basic idea is supposed to be that to explain whether like a system is conscious or not, all you need to understand is how well connected the different components of the system are. And like if you take this in a very literal sense, all it's saying is that the brain is an expander graph. And there are like a bunch of people, even like I don't know if people know here Scott Aronson. He's like a relatively well-known theoretical computer
He's also
scientist.
A rationalist.
Yeah, who's
writer,
also like now writing about other things. And he like even maybe like a decade ago kind of attacked that this is sort of absent other kind of additions to the theory is very silly. I guess the controversy is whether you should label this pseudoscience or just like an incomplete sort of theory, in the sense that the letter is kind of worded pretty harshly, and it's kind of saying that it's A, hasn't generated anything but silly sort of like predictions, and B, isn't capable of generating anything but silly kind of conjectures, and is probably not testable, certainly not currently, maybe not ever. And I think there's sort of like some pushback from the like largely, well, not just the neuroscience community, but also kind of like people who are in the philosophy community. Like David Chalmers is maybe one of the most famous people who kind of have worked on. He's maybe like he's most famous for the I guess like the hard problem of consciousness. And I guess their point is like we know so little here that it's kind of counterproductive to label kind of partial theories as pseudoscience, and sort of like completely cuts off inquiry, even if there might be something useful there. So I think that's kind of my gauge of, of what the debate.
Thank you, Andre. Just for context, again, when we do these, Alexander, just a second. I'll say something, then I'll ask you to follow up. So we do these meetings often, and then Andre, Alexander, Kirill, they know the dynamic, right? Like this is where we go off on tangents. So just for some context, the people that are not part of the class, Kirill is a researcher at NEC Labs in Heidelberg in Germany on artificial intelligence. Andrei is a professor at Carnegie Mellon in computer science. Alexander Shulevsky, he's an astrophysicist in the Netherlands. And who else? Ilya Dukovsky, he's a computational biologist at Boston University. So, you know, we have students, and then we also have some academics that obviously are more familiar with these issues. But it's nice to hear their perspective because, you know, in this class, you're going to get taught by many different kinds of profiles of people. And it's good to get the Macedonians' input. It's very controversial because that letter was very blunt. And it said, we're 120 scientists, and we think integrated information theory as an explanation of consciousness is pseudoscience, period. And I mean, I sent you the letter. It really is that blunt. And, you know, it feels against the spirit of scientific inquiry. You know, just get 120 people to just sign off something as pseudoscience and stop arguing and stop talking about it. It just feels, you know, against what I imagine science should be. And then Alexander had a follow-up, and then maybe Evelyn can kind of give her opinion.
Yeah, I'll try to be very short because it gets even worse or even more tangential. Because if you go and ask the question, what is string theory? 40 years of research, huge amount of money spent. You cannot falsify it, prove it or disprove it, and yet it is accepted as a tenet, core tenet of particle physics. In astrophysics, lambda CDM is like underpinning everything about structure formation, how the universe produced the galaxies we see nowadays. But there is a growing subfield which says that another theory called MOND actually is better, I would say. And here you see the mechanisms of how one idea morphs into another and the backlash. So these things are, I mean, science, pseudoscience, what is testable, what is not, they're coming back on a, like, in a real sense, even in this modern time. So these questions are not solved by any means. I mean, they're just there and they persist.
Yep.
So my response to this question, Alexander, is it's a good question. There's one way of thinking about scientific ideas, or just like theories, which is that you just want as many of them as you can get. You just want to maximize the number of theories and ideas, and quality actually doesn't matter that much because the majority of them are going to be bad. So this is like the idea of Adam Mastroianni's idea that science is a strong link problem, which means that there are some kinds of problems where the distribution that you're part of the distribution that you're paying attention to, the part of the distribution that matters is the very weakest part of the distribution. An example of this kind of problem would be in food safety. You're really paying attention to the very bottom, the weakest, the most likely to be poisoned food, the food that's most sensitive to temperature, and so on. In science, you have the opposite kind of problem. You just can ignore almost everything below the very best theories. You just want a lot of theories to be able to maximize the strongest, best theories with the most explanatory power. And in order to maximize the number of theories you have at the very top of the distribution, you just maximize the theories overall. So the idea here is that there has to be an effective mechanism to dispel with theories that aren't useful, that don't have explanatory power. I think there's like a real question about what happens when theories that don't have explanatory power in the lab have the feeling of explanatory power to individuals. So like you in pseudoscience, for example, you get the problem where things that don't test out, things that don't have any scientific validity, and aren't useful as a paradigm, still feel useful to people. So for example, like praying away your cancer, and then people decide not to go to the doctor when they have cancer and they decide to pray instead, and then sometimes people die and it's very tragic. This is the problem of pseudoscience in action in the world, is that people with poor scientific literacy or alternative perspectives don't necessarily, person by person, you cannot dispel with useless or like unreliable scientific theories. Over time, though, over generations, we may have poured, many millions of dollars into string theory, and it's come of nothing. But there's some amount of necessity to that. If it's a theory that's quite valuable, or it appears to be valuable, you actually do just have to test it out and see if it works. And the more theories you have, the more options, the more chances you have to find something that truly does work under scrutiny.
So I think this is a very nice point where we can open it up for discussion. We're already getting there. For those that don't remember, or maybe first time hearing it, Adam Mastroianni that Evelyn mentioned, he's our next guest. So basically next week, he will be in the class to talk about peer review. And I think it's going to be a great follow-up, because peer review is kind of tied in with this petitioning science away or towards petitioning science. And I think it speaks to all of these ways that the mechanism, that the system polices itself, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But, we have gotten to an age where science is a profession, lots of careers are on the line, and, sometimes heresy or, what is heterodox thinking is not really looked kindly upon by those that actually fund the science, which is very fascinating. So before we move to some questions, and also looking at the questions that people have been asking on Slido, Evelyn, maybe some closing points, something that you think wraps up your part of the essay, and then we can stick around for questions.
Yeah, I think connected to this last point about maximizing the number of ideas. Part of the reason it's interesting to think about the role of amateur science, and also to advocate for amateur science, is that there's an argument that our current scientific structure is breaking down. It's not achieving its goals. And there's some evidence for that might be that scientific discoveries are slowing down despite the increase in funding that goes into science every year, and despite productivity, despite an increase in papers every year, scientific discoveries have slowed. The theory is that perhaps we're not funding or supporting a wide enough variety of science, a wide enough variety of models, types of studies, subjects, kinds of people in science, because obviously the institution of science is very pressured selection on certain kinds of personalities, certain kinds of thinkers, people living in a certain kind of way. So the strongest argument in favor of amateur science, in favor of supporting it, giving it space and legitimizing it to some degree, is that you just fund and produce a wider variety of ideas. You create more diversity in the landscape of ideas and also in the landscape of scientists, and that overall that has the potential to improve the health of the scientific process overall. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that's a great wrap up. And that brings us to about 1 hour, which is what we were aiming for. And I think this worked beautifully without slides. Honestly, I really enjoyed just kind of, not having the crutch of let me show some data. That being said, Evelyn created some very interesting, what are they, kind of like boxes. One is the timeline of the evolution of amateur science. The other is this kind of distinction of how you could think of scientists on the professional spectrum. And let me just share so you know
that
what
one
I mean.
That one I borrowed from a paper written in collaboration between an amateur and a professional science about amateur science.
Cool. So yeah, this is from this Elsevier publication, New Ideas in Psychology. And then there's this timeline. Now, before we move to the discussion, this piece I'm really passionate about. I love it. I still don't know how it's going to appear online, but it would be nice to ask the students in this class on things that they could be adding to it. For example, maybe this timeline can be something interactive where you kind of hover and you see some things and it takes you to different links that describe a particular discovery. Maybe the timeline can be expanded and you can add other things here, and then we can create something that's a nice standalone interactive plot that goes from 1300 to 2100. Maybe this appendix here with the 4 categories of amateurs could also be, kind of giving you the types or the names of the scientists that belong to each of these categories. I think all of that would really kind of create a living document out of this. So when people are thinking about their case studies and about their assignments, feel free to, take some of these ideas and run with them. Even if you both decide to do the same thing, that's not a bad thing. One, sure, it's a competition, but in the other, it's kind of an adversarial collaboration. Maybe we come up with something really cool that can be added to this PDF. So I didn't intentionally want to show slides and talk about visual things, but this is something that's visualizable. So any feedback you have about what Evelyn put together, any improvements that you think could be done either on the design side or on the content side, it would be nice. It would be nice that, this comes out even better following the class. And we can discuss it more in 2 weeks when you're going to be presenting your case studies. And then Evelyn, you and I can sit down and decide what we want to do with this and where we want to publish it after some feedback from your peer reviewers who are in this in this class. And then next week, Adam is going to talk to us whether peer review is a good thing or not. So feel free to disagree with the suggested edits. So I'll start with a question that's in the chat because I see it. Ilya, feel free to ask it, or maybe Evelyn can read it while I look at the questions that were asked on Slido. Upvote, please, so I know which ones are popular, and I'll be reading questions. So, Ilya, Evelyn, I leave it to you to interact.
Yeah, so yeah, great talk. I mean, this is really fantastic. I love it. I was just wondering about the concept of citizen science. It's something that's happening in. I'm involved in bird watching, and that scientific community is essentially recruiting bird watchers to count birds. Every Christmas day all over America. Now it's getting into the on global. And I see that the value there as a way to communicate science more and get them involved, to get them into the kind of the social setting of and has some role in avoiding this kind of conspiracy theories about science and all that. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really cool movement. It came out of a time when people there was during the intense period of pressurization or professionalization, when it sort of reached its peak in the 1950s, it was considered, amateur science was considered to be very low status, and there wasn't really any place for it at all. Then in the 1960s and 70s, there were several different protest movements that came in reaction to pretty significant things that happened, and the public reaction to them. So in particular, 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear meltdown, and then Love Canal, which was a terrible situation where a bunch of a housing development was basically built on top of a chemical, like a chemical waste facility, essentially. And many people got sick. That was the beginning point of the environmental movement. And then the AIDS crisis, and public advocacy for the public voice being more important in setting scientific, in the direction of scientific movements, and in creating scientific policy, got really important for the public got really involved in saying, like, we should have a say in what our priorities are. We should have a say in creating the science as the participants, as the subjects of research, as the people to whom this research is going to benefit, particularly in the case of medicine. We should get to have a say in the process of creating it. And then citizen science sort of came out of that, but citizen science, the idea of citizen science came out of that as a formal practice. But people have just been participating, especially in the natural sciences, as amateurs, basically like in an unbroken line from before professionalization of science, especially astrology, geology, botany, like you're saying, ornithology, identifying and mapping and doing field work has been a huge way that amateur scientists or people who are interested in science have taken part in science. I think it's a good way to like promote scientific literacy, get people involved in a civic way, in the civics version of science, but also people who may not have the skill or time or capacity, or who may not really be best served by going into science, but who want to be involved in science, kind of have a role, can do more. This is a good time for expanding and developing citizen science also, because the technology we have makes coordination and actually integrating data from like a million different places way more feasible. So we're definitely like coming up to a time where the technology is making the capacity to increase citizen science and also make the kinds of things that citizen scientists are doing. We could definitely start to increase the capacity or increase the complexity of tasks of citizen scientists, and have people be more involved in massive scientific research projects without having to have degrees to do it or be on a payroll. And that I think it's really cool. And I don't necessarily know that it directly leads to this kind of diversification of scientific ideas that I'm talking about, but indirectly, I imagine more people being involved in science in general and having and increasing the status of amateur science can potentially have that effect of creating more people who are willing to go out with like produce and share scientific ideas that are maybe not like encouraged or condoned or supported by the current scientific establishments. Does that make sense? Did that sentence follow?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. So before I forget, would be nice to take a photo. If people want to be in the photo, please turn on your cameras. If you don't, that's also fine. Just keep them turned off. I guess your name will show up. Tell me if you want me to remove the name. And I will do this 1, 2, 3. Perfect. And I will share it now with everybody. So, tell me if there's a problem with the photo. I think it's nice for documenting it. We'll post it on the Twitter account. And just saving it for posterity. And now I want to start with a question from Alberto. Alberto, feel free to ask it. Like if I see you unmuting, then I'll read it. So this is a very Western perspective. And again, like we're aware of that, like we're telling science through the Western lens. Yeah. So Alberto says, how did amateur science differ between the European, Arab, and Asian worlds during the Middle Ages? Did you explore that at all?
A little bit, yeah. I would say I know a lot less about it, but basically there was a much more formal education in the Islamic world before there was formal education in Europe, basically. So there was the end of antiquity really kind of like launched the Dark Ages for Western Europe. And in particular, like this, the creation of the two, what had previously been Rome into two separate states, empowered a lot more scientific discovery and work in the Eastern world, so in the Islamic world. Eventually, this was the Islamic Golden Age that followed immediately upon the fall of Western Rome, or the fall of Rome and the Western Roman Empire. The time that the several centuries that followed the fall of Rome and the rise of Constantinople and the Eastern Empire created this like real rich time in the Islamic world, which eventually led to the founding of like a lot of civic societies, a lot of universities, or something that was like a parallel to universities, and also to hospitals, essentially the first governmentally funded scientific institutions, essentially. So the hospital system in the Islamic world was one of the first models we have of the government founding a scientific research establishment. And I don't know that there was like that doctors and physicians were also doing research. I'm not sure how the research happened, like, and who was responsible and how that was assigned within those institutions, but that's an anomaly within the ancient world generally, that that the government was like funding what was essentially a scientific institution. And this did tend to be the case throughout the ancient world, was that specifically astrology and medicine were, and physics for the purpose of building, were like the kinds of scientific research and projects that were very much like, that were much more likely to be funded by the government. I actually don't know very much at all about the scientific, the development of scientific institutions in Asia. And yeah, that's a good point, that this is definitely a missing part of this history.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's always been anecdotes, right? That lots of things that, China invented that, we kind of reinvented afterwards. So I'm not an expert either, but if somebody knows something, feel free to speak up. I think the Bill Bryson book is a very good overview, because it does also talk about science outside of the Western civilization. Let me. I'm just going through, picking ones that sound interesting, because people are not upvoting. Upvote the questions. Alyssa, has there been any recent significant amateur science discovery?
Many. There have been many recent significant amateur science discoveries, mostly in, I would say, in these kind of like scientific fields where people can mostly participate by observing. So botany, paleontology, recent like discovery of fossils, and in one case, like an amateur couple that just discovered one of the largest dino footprints ever found. There have been tons and tons of discoveries of new stars, planets. Pluto was discovered by an amateur scientist. There's just like a ton of this kind of thing. Amateur involvement in astronomy is huge still. Recently, in the last like 20 years, like people have discovered new, like new plants that have never been categorized, that kind of thing. But in terms of like, in the fields of physics or medicine, they do tend to be like less amateur friendly, partly because they just require more more expensive materials to study, or more particular kind of environments in order to do research.
Yes, thank you, Evelyn. Moritz, again, if you unmute, you're talking, otherwise I'm reading it. No. If you could change one thing about today's world of science, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, actually,
there's a good
there's a good case study for one. A big lever to pull in science is funding, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, what's his name? The guy who does Tyler Cohen. He's an economist, and he runs a blog that he's been posting on every single day for 15 years. It's a great blog if you're curious. It's called Marginal Revolution. Really interesting. Definitely he's like one of the smartest and most interesting people alive right now. He's just like knowledgeable about everything. He was given a huge amount of money at the very beginning of COVID to create his own grant fund, basically, and he created something called fast grants, and fast grants just gave money to like a ton of different research organizations and gave them basically money after like a 5 or 10 minute grant application, and dispersed the money like within 3 weeks. It's totally unheard of way of dispersing money. And that money was like that grant process produced a ton of research really quickly on COVID-19. That was extremely effective way of giving out money and supporting groups and scientists that just would not have made it through the grant process otherwise, and would not have gotten the funding so quickly. So I think it's a well-supported idea to be able to just give people access to money with less barriers and to give it to them more quickly. And that's probably like one of the biggest changes you could make and see significant results.
Which is related to what Stuart and Matt were talking last week. So it's very consistent. Basically, just try to diversify the way that you allocate money. Alyssa, you raised a hand?
Yeah, so I have a small question, because like when you think about funding, I think the line is like very small, but like once you start funding someone, doesn't it kind of become like professionalized science? You know,
Say more.
that's it.
I don't think, I guess my point is that there isn't anything inherently wrong with professionalized science versus amateur science. There are advantages and disadvantages to being paid to do work versus doing it from outside the academy, purely motivated by your own interest or curiosity. For example, being within the academy or being within a larger institution definitely holds you more accountable. If you're publishing under your own name and your professional reputation that's a matter of import to your work, then you have some measure of accountability that's not present when you're publishing anonymously or from outside of your professional reputation. Doesn't matter if what you do is right or wrong. So there are advantages and disadvantages to each system, and I think you definitely need to give people money to do certain kinds of funding. So there's no way around like, if you want to fund medical research and you need a certain amount of technology to support that, people just need money. There isn't you can give them money informally as a grant. You can give them money as a just, you can crowdfund. You can give them money as a patron and say like, I'll support whatever work you do, or you can put them in an institution, have them compete for grants. But however you do it, like there's some amount of this kind of professional in the sense that people just need to get paid or need to have money to do it. That's unavoidable. But then there are I'm advocating for just a diversity of models. I don't necessarily want to take the academic institution down. I think it's done a lot of good and I want it to stick around, but I also just want other models to flourish.
Thank you, Evelyn. Nadia?
I was wondering, I guess, because I didn't have time to read your essay, I'm really looking forward to it, but I was wondering if post-World War II, the purpose of government funding was sort of not to pursue knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and like whereas private companies are already leading the game in research in terms of real-world application, they have a real financial incentive. They make more money if they do research in something that works in the real world. So that's how they get funding for their research. So they kind of take care of that in their own sort of decentralized way, research that has real short-term, real-world outcomes. So do you think that some problems, I guess, with the current academic institutions in place would be maybe attenuated if instead of people trying to act like they're solving a disease, like everybody tries to make their I don't know, neuroscience people try to all make all their grants about solving Alzheimer's disease, people are more transparent about like, we're just doing this for the sake of knowledge because we don't know, and we don't know where this may lead. There's big pharma companies out there that are already developing really good drugs. Like, could that be like another sort of solution?
Just definitely this is a great solution, and it's being taken up very much. So this was the organizing principle for ARIA, for ARPA, and then DARPA, and then ARIA, which is the newest instantiation of this in the UK government, which are new ways of funding research, new basically government arms of creating research and funding it that basically aren't where the researchers aren't beholden to creating a certain project or solving a certain problem. These are models which are considered to be far more flexible and without as much oversight or like sort of like bottom line requirements for researchers to produce certain kinds of results. So ARPA was the first one of these, and then there have been a ton of like sort of spin-off versions of that. DARPA was the one for the Department of Defense. EARPA was the one for environmental studies. Recently, this has been taken up in the British government with their program is called ARIA, and they've created a new funding arm basically that is based on this model that people that scientists are empowered to do much more curiosity-led, interest-led, discovery-led scientific process rather than staying with a particular problem and then sort of banging their head against the problem until something happens.
Thank you. This is the question that we haven't touched on, and I think it's really important and kind of increasingly important. And now I lost it, so I'll rephrase. It's Muna's question. Found it. What ethical considerations should amateur scientists keep in mind when conducting experiments or collecting data in fields with societal impact?
Yeah, and, really important question.
This is, so start, and I think lots of us will have something to say on that topic.
Yeah, we have, I mean, the history of ethics in research, especially social science research, is, as many of you may know, extremely dark at times. And certainly the setup that we have now in academic science to protect the public from research that could be harmful is it's incredibly robust. It's also in many ways, according to many people who have interfaced with it, the IRB, pretty like, I guess, draconian or like hard to navigate, sort of intensely bureaucratic and very slow. So we have a regulatory problem here, and I think having a regulatory problem, in some ways it's a good problem because it means that we're doing our ethical due diligence. Right now, like, amateur science is just a Wild West. And if you're doing studies that don't require IRB approval, they can just ask anything, ask people to do anything. There's no rules. It has certainly like significant ethical implications. And on the other hand, you lose out on a lot of important science if you can't get it approved by the IRB. And science that could have significantly important benefits to the public. So there's an ethical question on the other side of how do you limit the regulatory power so that you don't prevent science from happening that could benefit the public, and how do you maintain enough regulatory power to protect people from the potential harmful effects of unregulated research, basically.
And from a very practical standpoint, there's a couple of ways that you deal with ethics. First, amateur scientists experiment on themselves. That's very, very common. And technically, you don't need IRB approval to experiment on yourself. Hospitals will argue, I actually spent months and months trying to scan myself with an MRI scanner that is perfectly safe. So, there's always exceptions. There's a great Scott Alexander post called My IRB Nightmare, which is hilarious and so illustrates exactly the kinds of labyrinths you get into. But if you plan about that ahead, there are ways to circumvent the biggest issues. For example, there are available consent forms. So you could just kind of, download a template consent form. Informed consent is very, very important. People need to know what they're doing and how their data is going to be used. So you can ask people to fill it out and submit it together with their survey responses or together with whatever experiment is done. That is one way of dealing with it. Sometimes, you can anonymize things so that, even though, you have individual responses, you only look at the aggregates, and that kind of removes some of these, privacy issues that are very important. And it's kind of funny that, on one hand, we are completely comfortable giving away our privacy on social media, and yet somehow when it comes to our, private data used for research, we think somebody's going to do something nefarious with it, when in reality, it's much more likely that, social media are doing the scary stuff, whereas the scientists really need the data to make a conclusion, but are made to jump through the hoops. So it's a very thorny subject. I've actually written something about it. I can share it here, but there are ways around it, and it should definitely not be ignored. Except we need to be reasonable about it, and sometimes these IRB boards are not reasonable. There's also this review of From Oversight to Overkill, which is one of the best book titles I've ever seen. And again, Scott Alexander reviewed it. Basically talks about the evolution of the IRB, how it was really necessary because there were some horrible things being done, and how basically it went to overkill, where now we're really getting IRB approvals for trivial things. Anybody else with some experience to share? I'd be curious. So let's, Alexander, yeah, go ahead.
Not exactly an oversight or ERBs, even though I don't know what the acronym stands for, but I get the idea.
Journal Review Board.
Okay, cool. But the overarching question is, especially in the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years, is the enormous bloat of administration superstructure in research. So by that, I mean the administrative layer at universities, at research institutes in general, in government even, gets to be really much thicker than needed, and even participates in the general finances of an institution on an equal part with the research staff sometimes. And you have sometimes even absurd situations where, for example, you would hire a really excellent candidate for a tenure track, and it's a tenure track, so 5-6 years of temporary contracts. Postdocs are on temporary contracts, and they have spent 20+ years educating themselves, and they're really good, published, etc. But then on the other side, you hire an administrator on a permanent contract right off the bat with a decent salary, even better than a postdoc salary in most cases. And this goes on and on. Like at the same time, you treat people like the researchers, whose main job is to do your stuff, much worse, because they have to apply for these grants multiple times, usually with award rates which are like 15-14%. And at the same time, the admin staff are working, taking holidays, none of the additional stress, well, at least not as much. And it's an interesting phenomenon, because sometimes, even most of the times actually, they create additional admin work for the researchers and for the doctors, even in clinical practice, just to have jobs for themselves, to get an even greater bloat in admin. And it's a vicious cycle, which keeps repeating. It was just a comment.
Yeah, thank you. A question from Mona. Again, I guess I better read it, right, Mona? I'll read it. In the absence of consensus, what methods or principles can we use to distinguish between pseudoscience and legitimate scientific practice?
Can you read it one more time?
Yeah, in the absence of consensus, how do we know what is pseudoscience and what is a legitimate practice? Basically, now we're saying amateurs can do science too, but then quacks, how do we keep them aside if we don't believe scientific consensus? That's the
Well, scientific consensus does matter. But like I think there's like the idea of science as a strong link problem is that if the pseudoscience doesn't have sufficient explanatory power, if it just doesn't work, it fails to be relevant pretty quickly. There are some areas in which this is actually pretty gray for the individual. It's hard to tell as an individual testing out one or another thing on yourself whether it's effective or not. If it works for you, you might think it's effective, and then you have no sense of its explanatory power in aggregate. But as a scientist, if it's testable, if it's disprovable, and if you can see whether it holds up under scrutiny or helps you explain sufficiently explains a question that you aren't able to explain with any other model, then that's how you basically like separate the wheat from the chaff. Whether it's practical or not is essentially the litmus test that you use. And this is different. The problem of this is that it's different it's different as an individual how you do the process of testing than it is for a scientist who has data in aggregate that they can see. There's a better than likely statistical chance that this happened because the theory is correct. It is difficult as an amateur scientist studying with an N of 1 to be able to say this medicine works, this medicine doesn't work. On the other hand, an N of 1 is an extremely effective way to test, does this medicine work for me? This is the benefit of using single subject studies, is that you actually don't need to know necessarily whether the theory is true in aggregate if it's an effective treatment or solution to the problem at the individual level. This is the sort of the work of one of the scientists I interviewed, Slime Mold Time Mold, is they run a blog where they're doing a bunch of research in nutrition. This is a really significant feature of nutritional research because so far there's been a lot of basically chaotic results in nutrition. It's very, very hard to tell what is not necessarily pseudoscience, but what is real and what is not, because there's just a lot of conflicting research in nutrition. The body and the differences between individual bodies are showing to be far more complex than we've been able to meaningfully model. And that means that studies at the level of one participant give a significant amount of information about that particular body. We just basically don't use that model of research at all in the current paradigm of science. But these people, Slime Mold Time Mold, and then some of the other people they've inspired have been doing research studies on a small scale, just people who are reading the blog and agree to do the study, or just themselves, and building models based on that.
Thank you. So to respond to Daniel's question in the chat, the names of the people, so a lot of them that we mentioned are also in Evelyn's write-up. So the calendar invitation had a link to the PDF. If you can't find it, email me, I'll send it to you. But yeah, you can find the names, and again, these are all great blogs worth checking out. Maybe we're going to finish with one last question from Jana.
Could I
yeah.
very briefly speak to Alyssa's question about how she got so many participants? I think it's a really interesting answer. This is I interviewed her also for this project. And this is one of the things she said she thinks academia should really change and improve on, which is she created that study for optimal virality, basically. She designed the study itself, the research, like the survey, to be as viral on the internet, as enjoyable a process to take as possible. It's an incredibly huge amount of data. She asked a ton of questions, and she included basically like every known kink that she could find on the internet. It's just a massive amount of data to collect, but she made it as easy to take as possible. And she also gave people like a character, a sort of like, she created like 16 types based on people's answers. And then she was like, your kink profile is like Cruella de Vil, or like your kink profile is like, I don't know, like other sort of like known characters from media. This is a compelling reason to take a test to find out what kind of personality, your kink personality or whatever you have. And the way she placed this on the internet also for people to take these was very intentional, as a way to get as many people to take it and spread it as possible. Her idea is that this is basically a totally underutilized aspect of academic research, which is that like academic surveys are basically just not at all designed with marketing in mind. And she was like, if academics were taking this idea really seriously, making surveys or research just like more viral and more popular for people to take, more interesting for people to like just want to take on their own and send to other people, this would be like a whole survey research on the internet would be like a whole other game.
Yeah, thank you. Daniel, you raised a hand.
Yes. So thank you, Evelyn. There were some great stories in your talk today. I have a question which is a bit unrelated or a bit more general. I wonder what your opinion is, or in everybody else's maybe opinion, of how important is it to know at least parts of the history of science to be, let's say, a good scientist, whatever that means to you, or yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I asked Ayla this question. She has basically no formal education. She above the high school level. She was like homeschooled in an evangelical like family for all the way up through high school. She went to like one semester of college and dropped out, and that's it. So all of her like knowledge is about science, and the history of science is self-taught. And I think a lot of what she's discovered has been basically she's like reinventing the wheel quite a bit. So beyond not knowing the standards, like typical standards for research, like for example, she like sort of converged on the 7-point Likert scale, just because after a while of doing research, she was like, oh, I seem to be getting the most amount of data for the least amount of effort on the test taker's part if I do a 7-point scale. And then she read a book and she was like, oh, this is just like already been discovered. It's good that she's validating this research and she's like coming up against this again. But I think there's I think like for efficiency, for the sake of efficiency, knowing a little bit about the history and about the field is obviously useful. I think the other thing though is more than just efficiency, is understanding the way, like part of what I came up with, or part of what I came to understand in the MRI research, is that understanding the history of the field of MRI research really helps illuminate where all the stuck points are in our world. Many people who were interviewed who did early research in MRI have said something along the lines of, I could never do this research now. This would never be approved. This would never be funded. I would never get grant funding for this. So like, just as a way of like understanding the conditions of practice that you're in currently, I think the history is really helpful for illuminating like strategically how you might operate in your own research paradigm.
Yeah, so I actually asked that question thinking, I mean, with the context more of academic research. I don't know how it was for the other people that got their formal education, I mean, PhD to do, or a formal training to do research. The institution where I'm in, very little attention is paid to history or even science philosophy, or maybe, let's say, general courses on the scientific method. Or we have of course, the courses are there, but I have the impression that the emphasis is elsewhere. And my impression was that it was much easier to, let's say, at least read up on the history of the scientific field that you're in if you're an amateur scientist, because you don't have burdens to do other work that you are paid for. Yeah, so I'm also curious what other people would think about it, especially those that have gotten a formal education in how to do research. Yeah, because in my institution this was basically almost non-existent, I would say.
So I'll start by saying that I got interested in this very early in my career, but I know that for many PhD students that interest doesn't come until they really kind of hit their head against the wall. So to me, the book that opened the gate was Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I think it really puts things in perspective and tells you this is how science works. And then Bill Bryson's book is another one where it's kind of like, oh, it's so random. And, thinking that you actually know how to do science is very arrogant. So I think the more you read about the history of science, the more you realize that it's a very random process. It's a very kind of strong link problem, as Evelyn and Adam Mastriani say. So I think you need that if you're going to continue with a career as a scientist. Whether you need it as a first-year PhD student, I don't know. I mean, it might be very discouraging to see that and read that, but I guess it does open your eyes to what's ahead. And that's always a good thing, or that's sometimes a good thing. I don't know. Hope it's a good thing sometimes.
So did you read it just by your own initiative, or was it like mandatory reading during your training?
No, it was not mandatory reading. I don't think I was ever exposed to any kind of structured course on the history of science. No, that's just me surfing the internet like crazy.
Oh, sorry, I think my connection dropped briefly. Yes, but I agree with you basically that these things are, yeah, it would be good for one to have read these things. Yeah.
Well, for everything there's a time, right? Like at some point,
Right.
you realize you need that.
Right.
Not
my feeling is also in some graduate programs, there's honestly no standard in terms of like the prerequisite knowledge. Like I feel like it's the era of data science, so everybody's using some random type of data and like getting outputs and interpreting, and then they write papers and they're interpreting it. But say you're working with, I don't know, genetic data, I think it'd be really important for there to be some sort of enforcing of like, you should probably actually know about how genetics works. Or with neuroscientific stuff, a lot of like people in my previous graduate program, I felt like didn't know that much about the brain. So I feel like even more generally, people should probably like have, like understand the history, because that also allows you to gain knowledge about the systems you're working with. But I think it'd be really good to encourage for people to have like a very go through the basics, even if the basics are more boring and less interesting. It's not fun to like read a biology textbook for from A to Z. But I think that would probably result in better papers also that make more sense, better research questions too as well.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you, Nadia.
great, thanks. Yeah, maybe we should input these thoughts also to departments that organize PhD training.
I think it's really important. Maybe the integrated program in neuroscience at McGill is actually better than most places. I think that there is kind of like a historical perspective on things. But again, that might be just my outsider impression while I was a postdoc there. Alexander?
Also, to be cynical, if you confront an administrator of a given department with the thought that, okay, we have limited funding, and on one hand, we can offer a course on history of science or philosophy of science, and on the other hand, a course on presenting skills, they would definitely go for the latter, because that is what is perceived as more useful, I think, and also because you're preparing a commodity PhD student which you want to put on the market. And if they can present, it's better in the eyes of the system than if they can know about how the scientific method developed. So it's kind of more practical.
Or you could have a course like mine where you're actually teaching them history of science and then ask to present. That's what I'm trying to do with this class, basically.
But those are in the minority, I think, or at least.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm having fun with this class.
Yeah, over here, I didn't encounter those. I mean, I read even in high school about the history of science, but that was only because I wanted to know, and I found actually a whole section in a Serbian periodical about astronomy on the history of science. And since then, I started reading, and then I shared a blog here of the history of science, and I have a couple of books because I encountered researchers actually where I worked who were engaged in writing a PhD thesis on the history of a particular person in astronomy, but they came over in a circuitous way. And then what's more interesting is that they were not used to offer a course or something like that on the history of science.
Yeah.
And that's the exception are departments like if they have a particular track. For example, in Leiden, they have a track of science and society. Now, I don't know if they teach history of science. I hope they do. But unless you have that, I find it that it's a rare department which will pay attention to that in a form of a course. Well, yeah, that's not good, but
Yeah, thank
one
you.
more idea for the administrators.
So now I'm going to ask the question that I've been waiting to wrap up with. So Jana, I really think it kind of gives Evelyn the last word, and it's a good way to wrap up. So Jana, do you want to ask it? Should I read it?
Sure. So can amateur scientists get involved in the professional scientific community, and will they be respected and able to keep up?
I think this is happening. Yeah. One of the pieces the chart that I linked to in this essay came from an article that was posted that was published in a journal that was written by an current amateur scientist who goes by the name of Rogers Bacon and a professional scientist that he was collaborating with. That person, Rogers Bacon, he also recently founded an online journal that publishes science from amateurs and also professionals. The purpose of the journal is to be serve as a place for sort of like more speculative and experimental, non-traditional research. And they're still trying to get that off the ground. It's called Seeds of Science. They just recently posted my MRI paper on there, actually.
Oh, cool. That's great.
I do think this is happening more. This is also the case very much in fields where there has been a long history of amateur contributions. So in astrology or in astronomy, it's much more common that there's like collaboration between amateurs and current researchers. But I do think this is definitely possible. In some fields, I think it will take a long time before amateurs will be seen as legitimate or knowledgeable or experienced enough to be taken seriously. But in particular, I think in some of the more like the field that I've had a lot longer of a history of amateur involvement, and also in social sciences, which the bar for research is so much lower, I think it'll be easier to make that transition.
I think this is a nice stopping
Okay.
point. We've gone for 2 hours. Honestly, I needed these 2 hours. They did me good. I hope they did good to some of you as well. Evelyn, thank you so much for taking this so seriously from day one.
Yeah.
You know, like really research, the writing, the passion with which you spoke to us today, and the breadth of knowledge is truly impressive. So thank you. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All
Nice to
right.
meet you.
So we're going to take a break, 15 minutes. Students in my class, stick around. Everybody else, it was good to see you, good to hang out. And next week, we're going to have Adam Mastroianni, and we're going to talk about peer review. And I'm actually curious if we should go without slides with Adam as well. But that's a conversation I'm going to have with my class. So Evelyn, thank you once again. We'll be in touch, and we'll find a way for this work to also get good exposure.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. See you, my class, in 15 minutes.
Thank you and bye.